All right, so we continue with that conversation this morning. What's making the headlines today? And one of those big stories is what the court has decided will be the case, that there will be the forfeiture of 202 million shillings from Mithira MP Rigathi Gachagua. And the question is, what does this really mean? So, I mean, as we're having this economic conversation, reflecting into, pre-economic state, post-economic state, post-election economic state of the country, it's really something to reflect, WOHORO, and ask ourselves the question. If you have an individual right now who is gunning to be the second in command, with this kind of ruling against him, what does this mean? I mean, what does this story then lend itself in terms of fueling the current situation?
I suppose it's a pretty sad commentary on us as a nation to some extent. This is a court of competent jurisdiction that has gone through the hoops. And might I add that, we have a judiciary that was set off to be a bit contrary to the established powers. So it's been even more insistent on its independence in how it's operated. And so for them to come through this process and end up with a judgment like this, now the timing, for whatever else you might think about the timing, it just means that two things that immediately start out of mind to mind. One is the economic benefit that is foregone when someone steals or is accused and proven in court of stolen that kind of money. Normally talk about in economics about a multiplier effect, about four times. In Kenya, it's about 7. So you can imagine for every shilling that's taken by an individual out of the public purse, it multiplied by 7 in terms of its impact on the economy. Okay, let's be conservative. Let's say 4. So if someone's taken 200 million.
They've taken 800 million.
They've taken 800 million of benefit in the economy. Now, if you've had through their accounts 19 billion,
multiply by 4.
Multiply by 4. That's the economic benefit that has been removed out of the economy. Now, until every single Kenyan begins to think like that, every time you see a shilling missing, or you hear someone's been accused of diverting a shilling, think, no, that's 4 shillings in terms of benefit to us as
that has been removed from the economy.
That's been removed from the economy. Because here's what happens, this is what we talk about income distribution, the inequality of income distribution, is that when a few are able to literally capture an economy, and that's nothing unique to Kenya, I think it's the world over. What's the benefit that's been foregone by the rest of the population? And a point comes which makes, to me, these particular elections one of the most consequential. Because ironically, in the midst of this debate, we now have a situation where one camp says it's about governance, which is absolutely true. But the other one is saying, no, it's not about governance, it's about wealth distribution, without asking the question of how was that wealth first generated. You've created a problem, you've created a situation, a near revolutionary situation now, where such a huge proportion of our population is so poor that a promise that you're going to share the wealth, basically you're going to do a Robin Hood on them, is very attractive. But it doesn't go to the heart of the issue of the structural. If you've not changed the structure of government or the structure of public finance to a place where we are confident that we will not have that sort of leakage, then all we're doing is just setting ourselves up for an explosion down the road. And part of the reason this is a good. That's how we should be thinking about a story like this. And if you're not, then we should ask ourselves, not only is that debate happening, but there doesn't seem to be any sense of governance in terms of will someone step down. Just normally, in fact, that's one of the big things with the Jubilee government. In fact, it started with the Kibaki government, that if you're accused, you step down while the investigations are happening. Clearly, that rule has gone out the window. So, what would that say to us if we do get to the election and Mr. Chebukati basically says, well, you guys are the one who chose the guy, so it continues. Is there anything in the law that says, for example, automatically you've been convicted, your name is removed from the vote register.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. In other countries that we know of today, call themselves democratic, call themselves totalitarian, whatever it is that you want to say, that once there was a whiff of anything like this, said individual would have stepped down. If it had gotten to the point where we've gotten to now, where you have an individual then who has been said of the courts, the judiciary in the country has said, because you cannot tell us without doubt where this money came from, you will have to give that money back. This is an individual now who is running for the second most powerful position in the country. In another country, by this morning, that individual would have stepped down.
Well, but it's not the sad truth about our continent. I mean, to be fair, it's not just Kenya, but this continent, by and large, will get away with that.
But now, this is what I'm saying.
And therefore, to me, the soul searching is around the question that, and you're right in everything you've said, but the soul searching should happen where we say, in fact, I'll turn it on us as Kenyans and say, what's wrong with us? What's wrong with me as a Kenyan? What's wrong with me as an African that I'll allow this to go? And is it what do I need to do to hold my leaders accountable? Because at this point, we've got a week to go to the elections. It's no longer about the elite, the ruling elite, because, that's a done deal. But what do you do as a Kenyan? Now, you could say I will not vote for X, Y, Z. That's exercising a prerogative. But even more importantly, is asking structurally going forward, this cannot be allowed. And the fact that we have a judiciary right now that seems to be fairly independent is actually a godsend. And ironically, it happened because of Maraga, annoyed someone. And then suddenly it gave the judiciary a backbone to basically push back. And so in a sense, this particular ruling is probably one of the most independently crafted ones by a judiciary that's very determined to be independent.
What will that structural change, what will that structural change look like to ensure, because as far as we're concerned, or from what we hear, there are safeguards in place to make sure that people do not pilfer public funds. So what would a change look like in the civil structure to make sure that people cannot run away or, have this kind of funds in their accounts, which, according to the courts, clearly belong to the government?
The only one we are given, of course, is voting. And I'm saying I think the inadequacy of that is pretty evident. The next question you should be asking is, right now, because we know the next government will be looking at the constitution. There's a position we must develop as a citizenry that says these are must-haves in whatever changes that are coming. But mind you, we only ever respond to the leadership. We never initiate things as a population. And that's what is a structural weakness in this debate.
The Kibaki era brought out something that even I even at that point in time, I didn't think I would see in my lifetime. Because, see, this situation we're talking about, the prevailing one, it was similar before 2002, where one got to the point and figured, this is the life we're going to live, and you might as well just adjust and get used to it. Public service will not be public service. You will not have civil servants doing what they're supposed to do. There'll always be someone looking for a kickback. This story we're talking about now, it was prevalent then. Literally prevalent. Then when the Kibaki government came in and one saw the stand that they made, the shocking thing for me was the citizenry followed. Which means all along, they were willing to do what they knew was right, but they were afraid to.
That's very true.
And I dare say, if that was the example then, in my mind, it is the example now. Most human beings don't want to be different.
True.
You don't want to stand out. So you don't want, if, say, for instance, in my neck of the woods, if the entire thinking process is that support for the leadership has to be one Raila Odinga, even if you think differently, you will be afraid to say so. If you come from the Rift Valley and the thinking is that the leader who's to be chosen is Dr. Ruto, and you think differently, you will be afraid to say so. When Uhuru Kenyatta was the leader who came from Central Kenya wanted to be president, and the majority felt was so, you didn't think so, you would be afraid to say so. It is how we are structured.
It's human nature.
We have learned, and ours is I'm saying is learned behavior. And the thing that we learn also, which is negative, is that when you have a preferred candidate, you also then look for every opportunity to speak ill of anybody else who you think is in competition with your chosen leader, whether it's true or not.
And also an opportunity to continuously sanitize your chosen leader.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what they
Now,
do.
if you start at the top, this thinking cascades down. So the allowance, and I'm calling it an allowance, that is given to the top leadership is then given to other people who also aspire for political position. So the MP can't give an account of the CDF, but somehow you sanitize it and you say, well, there's a to it. The governor is given billions of shillings, and there is hardly anything that can justify this expenditure of that money, but somehow, Now, the question my friend WOHORO asked earlier on, the solution. Actually, the solution boils down to what the citizenry is willing to do. Because again, we are the ones who choose the leaders, and after we've chosen them, the thinking ought to be, don't focus on the election only. Focus on what you do before the election, and then focus on what you're going to do once you've elected this person to ensure that they do what they're supposed to do. Don't leave them to run wild and do whatever it is that they want to do.
The question is, how far then are folks willing to go to make sure that an individual, a group of individuals, then just does not continue to run amok in these positions of leadership? And also, I think a further question to that is, then how uncomfortable have Kenyans become, or Africans become, with the status quo? Are you uncomfortable enough with it to do something about it? And then that's what we're talking about in this hour. The pre-election forecast, the post-election forecast. Look at the things that we are faced with today. How uncomfortable are Kenyans with corruption? How uncomfortable are Kenyans with the current state of things today? That the staple food in the country cannot be bought at 100 shillings. You can't find it at 100 shillings. That it is too expensive for the majority of Kenyans to buy. And let's be honest, that the majority of Kenyans are the ones who are looking for this 100 shillings for 2 kg. In some cases, it's too much. How uncomfortable are Kenyans with the fact that, in some parts of the country, the health system is not up to scratch? How uncomfortable are Kenyans with the position when it comes to education, that we've not really quite gotten it, even with the experts that we have in the country? How uncomfortable are Kenyans with the fact that millions of shillings is lost on a daily basis, that translates to 4 times the millions when it comes to what could be used to save them?
Economic effect. Look, I tell you one thing that we probably we took a turn on our political road, which I hope we will go back and correct and rectify. A critical solution is actually having an effective opposition. Well, something that we've not had in this country for the last 5 years. The fact that you have an opposition that's basically been co-opted, I think it was a good move for so-called peace to the nation, but it also meant that we lost the ability to hold accountable. The whole structure of accountability, then political accountability, failed because of that. But among other things, that is definitely something that needs to be reintroduced. Ironic, but unfortunately for us, is as tribal people, as Africa, as tribal people, we derive a lot of our own identity in our leaders. So that idea of a free pass is a given. The reality is, if you've ever been to some of these meetings yourself, and I've had the opportunity to be there, it's impossible to speak up. It's not just human; it's self-protection. You don't stand up.
It's self-preservation, actually.
Preservation. You have no way of overcoming that. So it has to be two things. It has to be structural, but the fact that, and this is hinted to what Kibaki did. Kibaki proved that it is not the horse that wins the race. It's the rider of the horse, and that the horse is the public service. Same public service, different effects. So again, unfortunately, we come back to the quality of the leader you get, and what decisions and how well prepared he is to do a Kibaki type of leadership, or you'll end up with a Kagame type of leadership. But it has to be decisive leaders who make the public service deliver what it's supposed to do. And we end up working in a circle, because even for that public service, the public service is on its toes if it has a very proactive citizenry that says no.
Before you give us what it looks like in terms of an economic forecast, yesterday we had Professor Lukoya Twoli here in the studio.
Right.
And he told us that people's natural inclination, coming off a comment that CT made, that people's natural inclination is to want to be corralled by one authoritarian leader. One leader who is going to come and say, do this, so long as it's in the correct manner, do this. And that people's natural inclination is to want to follow that. That we want to be told what to do. If so long as it's in the right way, we want to be told that, look, I am going to come in and clean this mess up, and this is the way in which we are going to go. That people will naturally glide towards somebody like that.
Right.
That is just how human behavior is, and that is how it is fashioned, Now, taking that into consideration and looking at how people are going to come and make or cast their ballots this August, sometimes we talk about as though it's the only election that will ever take place again. But in subsequent elections, how people will make that decision is very, very dependent on what they're able to access in terms of their basic needs today.
True. Okay.
Now, looking at the forecast, pre-election forecast, what are you seeing? What are you seeing as the state of things economically, or as somebody who dealt with, public debt management, dealt with, economic outlooks and forecasts for a long time?
To your first point, how you started that point, is it's true. When you become an adult, you free yourself from parents. But when you join society, you also want to be parented, and a government is a parent. However else you look at, a government is a parent, and the citizens are the children. And when the children get to a state where they are in this country, where this issue of flour, the difficulties that are in the economy, then one of the clear things that I see coming in the next government is whatever other conversation is that this child is fed up, absolutely fed up. And promises are being made that worry me, because they're promises which are being made when we have no headroom to finance them. And one come more than the other, but you have no headroom to finance these promises. The only other headroom we have, if they're going to find a way to finance it, in other words, we don't have space for new money. The only space that really remains of our own money is basically on two levels. We'll have to increase our revenue, more taxation, or we're going to have to cut government spending, which is also means government services. That dilemma is a very difficult one. And I think, to me, as I see the next economic climate post this election, is in the first 100 days, I think there's going to be some serious structural dislocations. Yeah. Now, that's if the intent is to move this country forward. And so if you're a public servant in your age 50 and above, prepare to retire, and retire suddenly. I don't expect it to be very nice.
Let me ask you.
If I need to free up some funds.
Yes. This magic with 100 days, what is it? I've never understood. Why 100 days? Why not 150?
Okay, well, yes, it's a figure of speech. It's only used because both sides do that, because you're sitting on a restive population that said, we've been asking and asking and asking, we're tired of asking. Now, if you say in the first 5 years or in my term, so it's a political gimmick, true, but there's some things you really should do in the earliest. And this, if you're going to inflict pain when you're coming in as an administration, you do it early, and then you spend the rest of the term, blowing on the wound you've created. So if you're going to make, for example, let me give you a good example. If you're going to lay off, let's say, 100,000 public servants, that's huge. That dislocation of the cost. But the same token, I talked about multiply effect. If you remove 100,000 people from the payroll, it has a multiply effect of times 4.
But we've done that before.
I know.
Okay, go on.
But I'm saying, if you're going to do that, if you're a political leader, it makes a lot of sense to do it in the first 100 days. Because then you've got the rest of the year. First, you create the budget space, and then you've got the rest of the year to fix the economy. And that dislocation at the beginning must be very strategic. Say that these 5-7 ministries where we need fresh blood, critical. So you say, okay, you guys, and you bye-bye, you have to go, bring in the next lot, at least get on with your program. And so to me, that's something the hard decisions that have been, this can has been kicked down the street for long enough. The next president will have to make some very hard decisions and move with speed, because he'll have goodwill, but it will be the shortest lived goodwill of any incoming president.
All right, let's take a break and look at weather and traffic, and then come back and continue.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
Our guest host this morning is WOHORO NDOHHO, and we are looking at the economic forecast, pre-elections and then post-elections in the country. So, I mean, look, it's the picture that's been painted, and in terms of then what can be done. What do you see businesses? I mean, because if we're looking at, what's happening, what do you see businesses doing right now? Not too sure of who's coming into the seat of administration. What has been the historical action in terms of waiting for a new administration to come into place, and then what happens subsequently?
That's right. Well, it's become our political habit as a country, of course, that 6 months to a year before an election, investments dry up. This last year has not been as bad. And then almost a year after the election is when investment comes back into space. And that's created, of course, a situation where out of every 5 years, we really only have 2 years of top speed economic activity or growth. The government has done a lot to change that, of course, including beefing the security, trying to make it more predictable, making sure that the electoral system is more streamlined so that we reduce that waiting. But if I was a business person, right, especially if it's actually two ends of town in business. Of course, the big end of town can afford to wait. It has factored that into its strategic plan. Now, every other business, which are popularly called SMEs, but which I'd like to call mainstream, actually, it's SMEs that are mainstream businesses. The big boys are the exception, not the rule. For most Kenyans, life goes on. You have to make ends meet. But for them, you'll see also, like right now, I've seen that a lot of them are stocking up. That's another way people start to spend their money, or getting rid of their stock, depending on what kind of business you're in. And so in the coming administration, one of the things I would like to say that clearly we've run the infrastructure thing. The infrastructure bandwagon has been run as far as it will go. For the simple reason that its returns and impact back on the average citizen is nowhere close to where it should be. I mean, we spend all these billions on our roads and our infrastructure, but it is only benefit very few. So both administrations, I can say for a fact, are only going to focus on business. And I'll actually say the next government must be an absolutely SME business. It has to focus on the small end of town, because that's where the aggregate demand is. And if you don't find a way of spreading the wealth or creating the wealth at that grassroots level, this situation we are in right now economically is only going to get far, far worse. And I don't know to what extent people are awake to that fact. I mean, there's a lot of promises, but I tell you, for example, but
simpler to
a simpler to do is just get off the back of small business.
Make it easier, make the environment conducive for them to operate.
Get off. The fact that right now you cannot start a business in Kenya without looking over your shoulder at what the government it will come after you for, has created this dynamic that it's a perverse incentive, basically. But it's created a situation where if you're going to start a business, you want to start it under the water. Because there's this hypervigilance of the tax authorities and everyone else coming after you. Now, truth be told, KRA has also tried to clean up its game, but the next economic revolution must be with small business. Top end of town will always look after itself.
Well, let me ask this question. How does government borrowing, especially domestic borrowing, affect the financial sector, and how does that impact on SMEs and their growth?
Oh, massively. If you are a CEO today and you've just received deposits of 22 billion, let's say, you go and buy a government bond, local market. Right now, the last infrastructure bond was at about 13%. So you think about it, 2 billion, you put it into a government, and it's for 13 years, 10 years, let's say. And you're going to be paid 13% every year. Why would then tomorrow WOHORO walks in with this small business with all its risks and wants you to lend to him? You won't. It's called crowding out, complete crowding out of the. So the next big thing the government must do is find a way of financing its programs from its revenue, not from its debt, because the moment it enters the debt market, then you and I as businessmen cannot borrow. The bank will not. Is not interested in lending us money.
But then isn't that a bit tricky? Because then we come back to the conversation of debt repayment, normalizing a situation where our debt is better managed and it isn't the burden that it is. So you're saying, in essence, that the task that is before us in supporting the SMEs is tied to the hip with the issue of our debts.
Absolutely. The government, and Kibaki showed us this.
Yes,
Kibaki showed us, and because one of the smart things Kibaki did was he just withdrew government from borrowing.
That's it.
And we remember situations where banks were setting up kiosks in malls.
They were hawking loans.
They were hawking loans to SMEs. I know a lot of my friends who, had a lot of businesses. I know one of my friends, he's built blocks of flats. He started building them then. Kibaki is in 22, he built like 4 blocks of flats. I said, well, I was borrowing at 6%, 5%. And I just it's too many. And of course, that's what began the Kileleshwa in growth in terms of urban infill.
Yes, exactly.
But if government gets out of borrowing domestically, then the banks can lend to you. But then the government then has to borrow from somewhere, so it decides to borrow from externally, which creates another problem because that's in foreign currency.
But is it always a problem? You see, this is the question, because
does it need to borrow?
No, the government needs to borrow. That we understand. All governments borrow. That isn't the issue. The issue here is this. Even when the government borrows, and we've been told that we are a lower middle income country. Is that what it is we're called? Okay. And because we're a lower middle income country and we've moved from being a banana republic, what it means is that we are not allowed, therefore, to borrow certain monies from certain institutions.
True.
Who wrote that rule?
Oh, the IMF.
Why?
Well, because the IMF and the World Bank, you knew it. And
You must see these things from far. You are a forecast man.
I can see it. But I'll take the bait. IMF, what basically IMF has done is it creates stratas, categories of lending. If you're in the bottom, and I can't remember what it's called, for the basically it's called them underdeveloped countries, you are allowed to borrow concessional loans at minimum interest rates. And usually like 1%, 0.5%, and so over 10 years or over 30, 40 years with a 10-year grace period. Sweet. But if you're in that space, then the IMF controls your budget because you borrow from them, and they say because you're this level, we'll be very specific where you spend that money in. So what happens is that you start then, you're happy at independence, and a point comes, they say, look, all government decisions still have to be sent off to Washington.
Have to be run by these fellows.
So what happens is with the Kibaki says, no, we can do better. And also Kibaki did say, look, we can raise more money of our own. Lipo ushuru tujitegemee.
Yes.
And immediately when he did that, he moved us from 300 billion to $1 trillion. And suddenly everyone thought, whoa. So he wakes up one morning and says, World Bank, IMF, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We don't need your money. We can at least cover our recurrent. If you want to do something with the development, that's fine, but it's on the margins. That's a perfect place that when this administration took over.
That's where we were at.
Yes, that's where we were at. But then this administration decided, okay, wherever infrastructure this guy Kibaki did, we're going to outdo him by a factor of 2, and he did. And our grandchildren might be thankful.
At what cost?
Well, that's the debate that we're having now. All I'm saying is that now we've had 20 years of continuous infrastructure development. You and I see the pain of it. Hopefully our grandchildren will see the benefit of it, because we had to do it. The question is whether we did it the most smart way by getting into commercial loans. At some point, basically what happened is, a point came when that tension between accountability tension with IMF got to a place where they said, no, we've got to do better than this. So what they then did is the government decided, okay, if we can raise our own revenue, we'll get to a certain stage where we move from that bottom end of the economic ladder. The next moment we move to the next one, we're no longer eligible for a majority of the concessional loans, but now we are allowed, and I put that in quotation marks, we are allowed to go into the open international market because we've got some street credit that we are managing an economy and we're in a growing economy. And the moment they did that, a moral hazard then appeared, because when you go into the commercial, international commercial markets,
it's the deep blue sea.
No one asks you the hard question of how you're going to spend the money. So it's like when you left home and suddenly you have money in your pocket. You don't have to worry how you spend the money.
Right.
You have to be disciplined how you spend the money. It's exactly the same. The moment we became a middle-income country, we went into that space where we could borrow commercially.
WOHORO, are we really a middle-income country?
Well, that's debatable.
Precisely.
We had a bit of buyer's remorse later. Essentially in terms of when we basically overdid our credit card, because that was coming to. when you go into commercial lending,
we ask for a credit increase.
Yeah, so you get a credit card, and then a very interesting thing happens when you get. And it's true also even in the credit, in personal finance.
Yes.
When you get into this next level of borrowing commercially, basically through the Eurobond and what we call syndicated loans, the only thing they ask is, are you good for the money? Are you going to meet your payment? Now, Kenya has never defaulted.
Yeah.
It's very, very powerful, because that gives us a certain amount of credit risk that's reduced. But you also discovered, but just like when you have credit cards, you can get 2 or 3 credit cards, and you can use one credit card. When you max out one, you can get another one to pay off the interest on the other one. That's also true for countries. And that's what Kenya got into. But it's not just Kenya. The world got into that. Then you had COVID.
You see, the question that I'm actually leading to is this. The model that you speak of, the model that we live by and we've accepted. But are they the only models, honestly, really? Because how do you find a situation where countries like Japan, whose borrowing as a factor of their GDP is stratospheric compared to ours?
That's 209%.
Okay? Precisely. And yet, they don't have the problems we have. And it's the model. Who are they borrowing from? And in what currency are they borrowing in?
Japan is very clever. It's not very clever, but it's actually the better way to go. What Japan has done is it expanded, okay, of course, massively. But Japan did it differently. The government, as the economy grew, began borrowing more from its citizens than from
external sources.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So today, when Japan has 209% debt to GDP, almost all of it is domestic.
Okay.
Which means every 6 months when the Japanese government pays interest on its debt, who does it pay?
It's citizens.
And those citizens who what? They turn around and buy more debt.
Yes.
So you have this virtuous cycle within the country. So the question is not a percentage of your GDP that you borrow, is who's benefiting from it. One last point. When you borrow externally, every time, even domestic, but in fact, even domestic, a good percentage of our domestic borrowing is also to foreign banks. So actually, there's even a faction within the domestic borrowing that's still flowing out. When you borrow as a government and you're borrowing externally, your interest payments benefit that other country. The same multiplier effect I was talking about here is also what gets exported.
Right.
And so you create a situation where you're not just paying $1 billion, but that $1 billion has the multiplier effect in that other country.
In the other country.
And so you create now, so that's where you kind of compound the problem, which is why the moment we begin to re-engineer this borrowing, so that when it comes back to Kenya, one of the things we should do, and we had created a product called Makiba. I do remember. One of the things we pushed very hard.
Yes.
Makiba was basically retailing treasury bonds so that Wanjiko could buy them. Because up to that point, you had to have 50,000 shillings minimum to borrow. The idea was we brought it down to 3,000 during my time in treasury. And the idea there was that every Wanjiko could borrow from the treasury. You could lend the government. And it was an infrastructure bond, which means it was tax-free. It was at 10%. There's no bank account that will give you that. Now, if that had succeeded, and one of the things I'd strongly recommend whoever comes back, story for another time. Well, I'll tell you a little bit later.
Yes.
What happened is when we did that,
No, go ahead, please.
what happened is that when Emma Kibo was issued, and I think it ended up raising about 200 million, ours was the first bond on earth that was mobile, a treasury bond that was mobile. In fact, we had delegations coming from all over Europe
To come on the so-called benchmark.
to come and benchmark. And then,
Yes.
sometimes we are our own worst enemy as Africans. So basically what happened is you would borrow, Wanjiko would borrow, and it was only 3,000 shillings to start. And thereafter you could buy even 100 bob. And you could just save. Then every 6 months when the government is paying interest, your phone would ping.
And the government has paid you.
And Wanjiko would say, whoa, she'd even forgotten she had borrowed it. And then if she had a stockbroker, everyone was assigned a stockbroker.
Yes.
You guys just call the agent and say, listen, when this thing pings every 6 months, just go back into the market and buy more.
Yeah.
Now, if we had done that from the beginning of independence, rather than just selling our domestic funds
Externally,
to banks,
yeah.
sell
Or
it to our citizens,
By
by now, half, which is what, 5 trillion?
What, you're talking about our debt?
I'm talking about the domestic debt.
That one, yes, it's half and half with our
That's right.
with our foreign debt. It's around 5.
So let's say about 5 trillion.
Yes.
5 trillion shillings would have been owned by all Kenyans, who every 6 months, when your government pays interest, will be paying back to
It's citizens.
its citizens. That would be massive and explosive, and it can be done. But you need a political will at the top, because it means it moves away from the elite-owned banks. You take it to the citizens.
So every citizen has
And that
an
is
opportunity
revolutionary.
to participate.
You could even make it that when you get your Huduma number,
Yes.
you also assigned a treasury account number. There's nothing to stop us doing that.
The Huduma number.
And every salary that is brought, they tax with one hand and you buy bonds with the other. So a point comes where you can actually be tax neutral, in that what you've invested in the treasury bond matches your tax obligations. It's
Right.
possible.
So you balance
Theoretically
it out.
possible.
Let me ask the question now. I look at Japan. Japan is the model that I look at. And I look at the government participation in commercial and industrial enterprises. Very direct.
True.
We had it on independence through ICDC.
True.
Okay? Story for another day, genuinely. But does it also help?
Absolutely does. Absolutely does. See, one of the things that it's not emphasized much in economics is that for all the story about capitalism is not value neutral.
No.
It always comes, there's always an agenda. And capitalism is only capitalism when it's to your benefit.
Yes.
When it's capitalism to your
Detriment.
detriment, it can be fascism. Basically, fascism is when companies capture government and mold them to service. And Kenya, to some extent, has a bit of that.
Yeah.
So the whole question of ownership of assets is at the heart of that process. So what happens with these governments is, when you are starting a business and the government said these are the strategic, it would identify these are the strategic sectors. And in these sectors, banks, you're instructed to lend at this, or even better, we are going to divert some of our tax revenue and put it as a pool towards, for example, heavy industry,
Okay.
like foundry and steel making. That's what Japan did. But Japan never stopped doing that. Because you're supposed to get to a point where the businesses are big enough to take off.
They've
never
continued
So to
doing
this
that.
day, when Toyota wants to raise capital, it doesn't go to the open market.
It goes to its people.
It goes to its people. And so you don't even need a pension. You don't even need a pension scheme per se, because the shares of your most thriving businesses are owned by the citizenry.
And the benefits go to the citizen.
And that's the critical thing missing in Africa, not just Kenya.
So then, as you look at a new government coming in, and you're right, I mean, the African continent, I mean, because I look into West Africa and I look at governments and people that are heavily dependent on subsidies. I look at Nigeria and I say, my goodness, for an oil producing nation that in many opinion, has relied heavily on oil, where it could have been starting to rely on other things that the citizens could then be directly participatory in, that's gone south in so many different respects. So looking at 2023, when a new government will come into place, the responsibility of expectation lies heavily on a new government to be able to start to look at alternative sources, like you're saying, for survival. Now, looking at a new administration that's coming into Kenya today, in the next, month and a half or so, what then is the expectation economically to be able to forecast and say, folks, this is where we must be in order to keep, the Kenyan economy's head above water? What must happen? What do you see happening? And what has to happen for any government that's coming in?
A critical one, as I've said, from everything I've said before, right now, just a moment ago, is you have to have a sea change in the philosophy of government. Yeah. Why is government there? And the government, you should always be suspicious of any handouts by anyone, whether it's foreign donors or domestic. The notion that the problem with subsidies and these other programs where you're promised something, it's always a top down. I always say the irony even with bottom up is that it's top down in this application. The same with the other side. It's still top down. We're all looking to a parent called the government to do stuff for us. What we need to do is to free the Kenyan, free him to do business, give him all the tools he needs to succeed. Tax him at the end of that process, but don't tax him even before he starts. And so the notion of a philosophical change is what I'm not sure I've seen even from reading both manifestos. If anything, both manifestos seem to be to banking down on hardening on.
There are four manifestos, WOHORO.
Yes.
But tell me, if
is
there anything in those manifestos that at least stands out? The answer is no.
Carry on.
There are four manifestos, yes. Yeah. Two of them have a good chance of being implemented. But I still have a question with the Kwanzaa manifesto, because there are actually two floating out there for Kwanzaa manifesto.
Which one to follow?
They need to clarify that, because one of them is a communist manifesto and the other one is not. But both of them have the same thing.
It's a mixed bag.
And so that concerns me a lot. Anyway, back to your question. It has to do with the fundamental. If you're going to restructure this economy, you have to decide whether you're going to free the people or not.
Right.
Especially our business people. It's extremely hard to do business in a town where you're always looking over your shoulder, and it's completely dominated by the top 5%. Actually, 5% is a bit generous. 2% of the population. That has to change, and because neither of the manifestos addresses that, a part of me is fairly cynical that we'll get too much of a sea change in economics. To be about managing the proletariat, not to rebel, really.
How do you get these 1-2% who more or less contribute to these lovely numbers we have in our GDP to actually love the idea of being compliant with taxation? Because if I'm to go by
but taxation, okay. The cynic of view, taxation has always been
resisted.
Taxation ever is resisted, and not only resisted, it's always structured. Okay, put it this way: taxation in the world over, is really a wealth transfer from the middle class to the upper end of town. But it's done in such a way to keep the peasants happy
is there,
and to keep the middle class working very hard, because that's what generate the tax. But okay, I'm being facetious. But
I'm laughing because what you're saying is actually true.
Yeah, they call me a communist, but I'm not a communist. I'm a businessman, and all I want to do is I want to be free. One is to make money, as much money as possible. Two, I want to be able to keep as much of my money as possible. Three, I'd like to, thank you very much, pass it on to my kids and my grandkids.
Yes.
And then pass it on.
And they don't have to be, and I don't follow them, because I'm passing them onto them already taxed income. It's not like I'm giving them something for them to be taxed.
Okay,
everyone's moving towards that.
We've got to go to the top of the hour and come back and continue with these conversations.